Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney and Director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust, as well as Director of the Festival of Urbanism, which I'll say something about in a moment. Before I do, I too would like to thank Wally Bell and Catherine Denny for that very moving and generous rite of passage. It was very meaningful. I learned something I haven't experienced. A cleansing ceremony. I beg your pardon. There you go. I was just about to say, oh, is that... Wally, please come up and do the rite of passage. Thank you.
We have lots of traditions. Not all people have several different clan groups, family groups, and we move around on country a fair bit. Now, that's part of our process of looking after the place, caring for country, because we know that if we stay in one place too long, we're going to impact it. And by our movements around on country a lot, we're looking after the place. So during those movements then, we always seem to bump into one another, and customarily, we always greet each other. So I'm going to say our greeting word to you guys, and you have to say that word back to me, but you've got to do it enthusiastically. I've had some bad ones, I can tell you. Anyway, that word is Yuma. You haven't got the word right. Jeez. Yeah, it's one of those funny things, I think, with language. And but if you didn't know, that word means hello in our language. And if I was to go now, I'd say yada, which is goodbye. Okay, so now you know two words at least. My people, the Nunu, we've lived on country here for a little while, I guess. They've done a scientific carbon dating of one of our rock shelter sites called Burley. Now that dating come back at around about 26,000 years. So I've been here for a little while. We actually moved into the area just after the Ice Age receded, which is something like 34,000 years ago. So that scientific dating is just an indicator of that one place. We occupy an area of something like between 17 to 18,000 square kilometres, and that includes the whole of the ACT. It's a man-made territory, I guess. So all the land in the ACT then is leased from New South Wales, which creates problems for us as the traditional custodians. We now have to deal with bureaucracy in many different ways, especially when you do the work that I do. I do cultural heritage management work primarily. I do a lot of other consultation sort of work in relation to culture. So that's where the bureaucracy it's sort of out of hand. But living in this day and age, you've got to deal with it. We, like I said, have different clan groups. We have about 7 of those clan groups. My clan group are the Ya. We come from, well, everybody probably knows the place now as Yass. Okay, so that's where my clan group come from. So I've learned all about country as a young fella in our traditional way of doing stuff, by going out on country with my father and him teaching me everything that I know today. Although I'm still learning some things about native vegetation, for instance. It's something you don't learn because it's always a learning curve, especially with changes in climate and all that sort of stuff now. The way that we do stuff then is done according to our traditional customary law. That's LORE stuff. All Aboriginal people Australia-wide operate to their customary law. So they, like us, are all bound by that law. Within the Ngunnawal people then, our clan groups take on different totems as part of that law. So my clan group totem is Mullingung, platypus. So that means then that we have to care for and protect that platypus while on country. We look after all the waterways so that they flourish, and there's a lot that the other clan groups have to do as well. And our totems aren't just animals. You can flora or fauna, which means that everything gets looked after on country. So as Aboriginal people, then we get our customs and belief systems from the place that we live in. Now, by saying that, I'm trying to point out the fact that as Aboriginal people in Australia, we live in all these different places around Australia, which means then that our cultural practice is going to be quite diversified. So there's a misconception that Aboriginal people do cultural practice in exactly the same way, and there's no way that we do it that way. Primarily from the point that we live in different places. For instance, Ngunnawal people live here, and we've got land in fairly big hills. Our neighbouring group, the Yuin people, for instance, pretty much the same. They've got good lands and big hills, but they've got ocean. So that gets incorporated into cultural practice. Something we don't have here. So that then means that cultural practices between us two, the Ngunnawal and the Yuin, is quite different. And that happens all around Australia. Here on Ngunnawal country then, what I'm here for today is something that I believe is incorrectly labelled. Now in the old days, if we were going, say, onto Yuin country, we'd have to send somebody out from our group carrying with them a message stick. So we'd have to find somebody from, say, the Yuin people, and that message stick would have a request to be there on country. So we're asking out of courtesy and respect to be allowed on their country and to be able to make use of the natural resources that are there, for tool making, bush foods and things like that. They then in turn would give us permission to do that. But they'd also have conditions for us as well. As I said before, cultural practice is different, so they're going to have places that they hold sacred, that they don't want us to know about or enter into, and they'll tell us about that. I'll say, you can't go over to this area because it's a sacred site. Can't go over into this area. It's a women's business place. So those are the sort of conditions that get applied right across Australia through that process. The reasoning behind it all, I guess, is to protect culture. And that's the most important part for us as Aboriginal people, is the protection and preservation of our cultural practice. So we here on Ngunnawal country then, my clan group, we once we go through that sort of process, and if we were letting, say, one of the other groups, the Gunnangala, for instance, come onto country, we'd give them permission to be here, and we'd also have conditions for them to abide by as well. So the other part of that, though, is we're not only going to give them permission to be here, but we're also going to look after them and care for them while they're here as well. So our way of doing that is we're going to look after them in two ways. We're going to look after them in a physical sense, and then we're going to look after them in a spiritual sense. So the physical part's going to be taken care of by what we call our spirit of the land, which means then that as they're actually walking around on country, the spirit of the land will look up and look out for them to make sure that nothing really bad physically happens to them. The other part, now everybody here, you've got your own personal auras, and I mentioned that before, and our customs and belief systems to also tell us that there's bad spirit out on country. Now that's the element that you can't see or touch. Yeah. But that bad spirit has a tendency to latch onto your auras. So if there's any bad spirit around, although we've been cleansed, it's a sneaky old thing. He might have been avoiding the cleansing. He might have been jumping from person to person. Nobody knows. But if, just in case, we're going to call upon our past generations, our ancestral spirits, to remove any bad spirit that might be remaining. So to get that underway, what I've got to do is make a little bit of noise and make sure that those spirits are here with me to look after and care for you while you're on country. So I'm going to make a bit more noise with my sticks, and hopefully we'll get those spirits to join us. Alrighty, my being a Ngunnawal man, and I do a lot of work out on country, so I have really strong tie with my land. I can tell that those spirits have now joined us. Hopefully you guys can feel their presence as well. As I said then, the spirit of the land will now look after you as you walk around on country to make sure that nothing really bad physically happens to you. Our ancestral spirits are now going around to everybody present, looking at your auras to make sure there's no bad spirit that might be remaining latched onto you. But if they do find that stuff, they just grab hold of it. Toss it off country, get rid of it, something we don't want here. We don't want it to affect you as a person, and we certainly don't want it to affect the land that you're on. The spirits then ask that you do two things while you're on country. First one, the important one, respect this place that you're in. Look after it, care for it, as we have now done for thousands of years. Second thing they want you to do is also to respect and be kind and courteous to other people that you meet while you're on country. So if you do these two things for us, the spirits will then harmonise with your stay on Ngunnawal country. So may the spirits be with you today, tomorrow, and for always. Dalawa nunna, Dalawa Ngunnawal, Yangu Nilaweli Dinamayan, Naraganawale. This land is Ngunnawal land. We've all come together today for a good old yarn. I'll finish off with what I like to call a rite of passage. So it's what we used to do, and I want to try and revive that way of doing stuff. So on behalf of the Ngunnawal people, my clan group, the Yar, I grant everybody present right of passage on Ngunnawal country. John Yamaba, thank you.
Wow, thank you once again, and particularly thank you for granting us the rite of passage. It's, as I was saying at the beginning, it's the first time for me in Ngunnawal country to experience both that particular smoking ceremony, which was gracious, moving, very informative as well, and then to hear that incredibly insightful and moving set of perspectives about the importance of understanding what country we're on, the deep history involved in that country, and something very, when you think about it, very basic, the concept that we actually ask before we enter country, and that when that permission to be on country is so graciously offered, that also comes with obligations to that country and to the people of that country. And so with that, thank you once again, Karen and Wally. And thank you very much to ACT for giving me the privilege to be the first person from the Festival of Urbanism to speak in welcoming the rest of you to today's event. So I'm here and I want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Gadigal country in the Eora Nation, which is where I live and work and which is where the University of Sydney's campuses, some of our campuses are. They're elsewhere in many other countries in Australia. And I also want to acknowledge that I grew up in Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of Bundjalung and to elders past, present and emerging. Of course, I also extend those respects to any other Aboriginal people who are here in the room today. And I've seen Christian Hampson as well as over there. Hi, Christian. I've met you online, but it's going to be a great pleasure to meet you in person. Look, I don't have much more to say. I just wanted to mention that I'm the director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust. I'm Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney. The Henry Halloran Research Trust is a cross-disciplinary research centre based at the University of Sydney, and what that means is that our mission is to draw together the different bodies of knowledge at our university, so certainly from architecture, design, planning, but also to medicine, to engineering, to arts, to anthropology, history and beyond, and to direct that knowledge at problems facing cities, regions and communities, and to do that in conversation, in dialogue and collaboration with community leaders, with industry, with government and with the wider public. One of the ways that we do that is through our program of public events, and the Festival of Urbanism is our flagship annual event. It's, as the past couple of years, it's become a national event. So we've got a weeks-long program in Sydney that's just concluded, but we also have programs in cities across Australia, including Lismore, which is the most recent one. But it's an absolute delight and privilege to have this event. This is the second time we've had a Festival of Urbanism event in Canberra. And with this year's festival theme being the Festival of Public Urbanism, I can't imagine a better place for this particular event about the public city, which of course is Canberra. So I'm actually going to now just introduce and hand you over to the chairs of today's event. Firstly, Dr. Maxine Cooper, who I'm sure all of you here know, but let's just read the headlines of her bio. She's a Fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia, member of the ACT Planning Institute of Australia Committee, She's an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, and she's the chair of the ACT and Region Catchment Management Coordination Group, the chair of Landcare ACT, and the deputy chair of the National Landcare Network, amongst her many other accomplishments. And she's joined today by Thomas Carberry, who's the ACT Planning Institute of Australia co-vice president, as well as senior planner urban communities at SMEC. So thank you both, Maxine and Tom.
Okay, well, first up, Wally, thank you enormously. Where are you, Wally? There you are, right at the back. Thank you enormously, and Karen, and I am always privileged not only to be on Ngunnawal land, but they're friends now who take us on a journey that without them, we wouldn't know the real history of the place. So thank you. Nicole, thanks. Thanks for trusting us as Pia to get on and put this event on. It is a real honour. Okay, well, our topic today, planning the public city, as Nicole said, tackling wicked problems in the nation's capital and region. So what are wicked problems? Just think of one yourself that you might think is a pretty wicked problem. Well, here in the capital, some might think it's simple. It's simply the planners. The planners are absolutely the wicked problems, and if we got rid of the planners, we'd be right. Well, wicked problems are not necessarily one person or one entity. Wicked problems are something that's incredibly difficult to address, in fact, sometimes impossible. There's no single solution, so you can't shoot all planners. And wicked, in this case, is about resistance to resolution, not an evil intention. Usually it involves stakeholders with radically divergent views on a problem and solution. It's a unique problem requiring a bespoke solution, and no solution can be absolutely right or wrong, so there cannot be a simple approach. Does that fit your world that you work in? I think for most of us it does. Here in Canberra, we enjoy the legacy and challenges left by a couple of great planners, Marion, from my perspective first, and then Walter. We have a well-planned bush capital and a region known for its livability and natural diversity. However, maintaining these attributes will depend on how Canberra addresses the wicked problems that you'll hear about today. We're going to have 5 speakers, and they're all outstanding and diverse. And if you wouldn't mind, hold your key questions right till the panel session. So before lunch, you're going to hear from 2 speakers. Christian will talk about design with country, going beyond the Griffin legacy, and wait for it. The question is, if the Griffins had co-designed with country, would Canberra be even better? And Julian, he's going to talk about reviving green streets, Canberra's leasehold system and environmental potential. And he's going to explore the relationship between the lease system that we have, which is quite unique, and public landscapes, questioning whether a renewed consideration of the relationship between the land, the tenure and environmental performance could help reinvigorate green street designs for the future. Then we're going to go to lunch, and it's in this room. And then Dr. Paul Wyrell is going to talk about connections and care. Murrumbidgee is an urban river. Them's questioning words for some. Paul's talk proposes that Canberra's water energy connections demand an ethics of responsibility from its residents towards the Murrumbidgee, and highlights opportunity, and he's going to highlight opportunities to actually take action by engaging with reforms of water policy and urban planning. Then Hitomi, where are you? Hitomi Nakanishi, she's going to talk about sustainable transport for Canberra and the region. She'll discuss Canberra's clearly wicked transport problem and the dilemma its planning legacy has left, which is that we've got a low-density city and public transport is really a challenge. Matt, where are you, Matt? Matt's over there. Matt will talk about the importance of good planning for great communities. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that concept. And in talking about that, He'll share his role as the CEO of the Peer Institute. He'll discuss the importance of good planning being a key enabler for solutions to some of our big wicked problems. So following those presentations, there'll be a panel session, and right now it's my total pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Thomas, to introduce our first speaker. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Maxine. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the day, Christian Hampson. Christian is the CEO and lead design and co-founder of Yarrabinjan. Christian is a proud Woiwurrung and Manaroo Aboriginal man with a 30-year career in biocultural conservation and collaborating with First Nations communities across Australia. Christian brings to country a methodology and design sensitivity in planning places, inviting us to move with country rather than be on country. Christian is an innovative leader in the design industry, pushing for the widest possible range of ideas from which to select, not simply find a single best solution, interweaving Aboriginal tacit knowledge and collaborative design thinking to walk a new path away from conventional approaches. Please everyone join me in welcoming Christian to the stage.
Geez, that sounded impressive. I didn't write that. In my language, Wamajika, Mapmananyata, Christian Manaroo, Woiwurrung, Dagabu, Mianga, Ngunnawal. I am a Manaroo Woiwurrung man. Acknowledge, thank the traditional custodians for their welcome here on Ngunnawal country today. Very important. A process of acknowledgement is something that we all thankfully see and hear much more prevalent today. But we as First Nations people has been part of our protocol, as Uncle Wally and Auntie Karen talked about, is that this is a process of not only helping us look after ourselves when we visit other country, but also an acknowledgement of how we need to act and respond and the emotions that we should feel when we're in other people's countries. So the great thing about design today is that a fundamental principle of how we think about it is it's not so much the script. Many cases, for many of us who worked in government departments, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience in that, is that people are more worried about the things the things they say when they acknowledge country, but it is actually the words, even I don't know, is an acknowledgement of country. We often see lots of signs, lots of things, but it is the opportunity to respond to the welcome of traditional custodians and the opportunity that we're allowed to have a cross-cultural connection. As Unc talked about, we are a multicultural society, First Nations, Aboriginal people. We live in many different places and many different practices. So that opportunity of acknowledging country is something that connects us all and gives us all the opportunity. So design, we often think about that being our first principle. How do we design a place? How do we design a city? How do we design the things we learn and live and care for each other in a way that gives everybody the opportunity to acknowledge and connect and learn about country and have that very special opportunity. So the word country gets used a lot these days, and this is my personal reflection. As a young man, I was very lucky to be guided by my grandmother and my mother. And this discussion is that for me, the empathetic relationship that I have with country is about, as I speak as her as my mother, and I speak as her as always my teacher, but also a landscape that knowledge is stored, collected, shared, reinterned, and cared for by cultural and social practice. So our approach and connection is about our kin, so our non-human kin, the animals, the plants, but the mountains, the rivers, all those things, those elements of country, as Uncle so strongly pointed out there, are part of that. So they are our kin. So we have this empathetic approach, and we often think about in design, we empathise with people and try and understand what they need and desire and fear and how we can support them, the experience of place. So all we're doing is offering you a more extended connection of empathy. And I think for us, when we think about the opportunity is that for people we can individually experience country, and then collectively we can also experience. So how does design, how does planning, how do our approach to that help us? I was always brought up, I was very lucky, I worked in national parks for 23 years. I went to Taylor Primary School in Canberra, and when it opened in 1974 or 5, something like that. I then went to Canberra High School, did my first degree at University of Canberra as a Cultural Heritage Management, and then left in 1995 to join New South Wales National Parks. And then had a 23 career there. My first job was a very lucky job. I worked with Barkindji people working on rock art conservation in Western New South Wales, and had an incredible experience for all my career in national parks of working and being guided by so many amazing community members, uncles and aunties, brothers and sisters. I always had the great privilege of working with Uncle Wally's mum and dad at Oak Hill, and hearing of their amazing memories of growing up there and collecting water and all these things, even about how they had this amazing frugal engineering where, you know, they made places for them to live and treaded very lightly in the way they designed those places. And so also our amazing adaptability. You know, we're the first engineers, we're the first innovators, we are the first environmental managers, first ecological scientists. All those things are things that we try and think about within country. How do we draw upon it? But the other thing my nan taught me is that country is also an incredibly complex, the most complex environmental database in the world that we are part of. And so it is a system that is both of ecology, social practice, cultural practice, but knowledge. And we do not have a written language. So all of our cultural practice, our art, our story, you know, all the things that we share through generations are part of this system of knowledge to allow us to keep tens of thousands of years of environmental knowledge as a database. So we've all heard about the cloud, right? Well, blackfellas invented the cloud. This. Can you imagine that amazing diversity of knowledge, all that natural history? You know, how did we learn that particular plant is great for you and this one kills you? Well, unfortunately, there's only one way you learn if that plant kills you. Someone had to test it. So that knowledge is then part of that system of our relationship to each other, and how a piece of knowledge is held sacredly by individual people within a community. But then also, we are connected through that relationship to other communities. So if I have a role in my community to hold a particular piece of knowledge, which might be about a particular part of land management or practice or ecology, I have a brother and sister in the neighbouring mob, because of course what happens, we don't, you know, that knowledge has to sit in our brains and be connected like this big spider web, as my nan would describe it. So if I was unfortunately, not mucking around and fell off a cliff or something was gone, and I had all that knowledge and no one else had it, it's gone. So we always have this amazing connection, and she used to say that spider web would be brought back by our neighbours. And so often when we came together in big groups, we also had kin who were about our equal responsibility. In many cases, we had practices were about that role. So incredibly complex. And it is there about this particular thing about holding and storing our cultural practice, our ecological knowledge, which are all intertwined, and our social systems, and amazingly complex systems. So sometimes when we think about country, it's not just a weird type of music. It is actually this, if you sit down for too long, your brain might hurt and you might need to lie down. And I've got a 1-year-old and 3-year-old at home, so I probably need to lie down myself right now. So again, as I said, these traditions are not just things that we do, they are a responsibility to the future generation. They are us standing on our ancestors' shoulders and bringing our next generation and placing them on our shoulders. And that was why I was taught as a young person, and an incredible opportunity. And so if you think about it, that way that we store knowledge in the landscape is reflected when you might hear about the word songlines. You know, there's a story down at the end of the Great Dividing Range where my nan comes from that talks about the platypus. That story has its own unique component in that landscape, but it goes all the way up to Narran Lakes, up past Walgett. So the reason that is like that is because there's this opportunity to both have knowledge but then have it spatially stored has been shown to be the most complex way that we think that we can store and recall knowledge. And so there's a neuroscientist who did a study on this, and she decided to teach herself a new language, and the way she did it was when she walked to work every way, she placed pieces of knowledge in parts of the landscape, and where she went past that landscape, she drew that knowledge and placed it back. And then she found that was an incredible way for train our brains, because our brains aren't very good, right? human brains, I think, I don't know what the percentage is. They say we use a certain percentage. I don't know how much of mine I use these days, but that was designed by our ancestors to ensure that what they were learning was always passed on through all this practice. So when you experience cultural practice, art, song, dance, these things are there as part of this complex system. So Yarrabingan, the word comes from my grandmother's language, and I remember going to my old uncle who lives these days down in the beautiful Narimma. We're down there recently, seeing those amazing whales come past and say hello to their mob down there, the Yuan. I was sort of talking to him about, I had this idea about co-design and what does co-design mean when we empathise and allow people to discuss their relationship with country. And so Yarrabingan loosely means we walk together. I mean, the thing is when you take our language and translate it, but what it actually means, you'll see the logo is we walk in the footsteps of those who teach us, and you'll notice that the human footprints are last, because that's where our footprints should be. We should tread in the footprints of the kin. So it talks about in our language a time when we transformed from spirit to human, and then how we were then given the knowledge to live appropriately within country. So for us, one of the things these days, the opportunity to design with country is, and so to tell you a bit more, Yarrabingan's an Aboriginal-owned urban design company. I have everything from mural artists, people who are right into, hydrological engineering. I have a whole team of landscape architects. We design our own projects, but then we also work on things such as master plans, but then we have the great opportunity to work on very small community-based projects, hospitals, all sorts of things. And it's an amazing opportunity now about how our world is understanding that by acknowledging the country that we're in, we can create better places. Places will function better. And so the 4 pillars that we talk about are these for us. So when we think about the values that sit within country, and many countries have all these elements in different ways. I've talked about, salt water, and there's fresh water, there's the geology, there's the sky, there's the wind, the water, our non-human kin, and then there's us also as an element of country, how we move within countries. So what is the possible impact and outcome of designing with country that we can bring? And when we think about planning a place, how can we think about a place at scale? So custodianship is one we talked about a lot, and so that is this platform that you have to make space for traditional custodians. That's part of it. But also, it's designing places so that people take on that connection and responsibility to become future custodians. I have an amazing old uncle, Uncle Ray Davidson, who's a Gadigal elder who works with us, and he often talks about it does not matter where you come from if you take up that responsibility. In particular, young kids, we love to see them seeing themselves as the future custodians. And when we think about, the places, the schools we design and make, the places where they learn, they must be engaging with this opportunity. So that opportunity of connection to place, responsibilities to place, is also about custodianship. Innovation. People often think about innovation as being an outcome of design. Designing with country allows you to have it as also a process, because you are looking and understanding. When we think about how do we adapt to climate resilience, well, there are human kin and non-human kin around us who are teaching us and telling us already, because they're already doing it. Many of our trees and other animals are changing and shaping, and always have, because they've always gone through climate change. How do we think about innovation when we think about, and often I think about, it's about diversity of thought. Best example I've ever seen was an old auntie when we were in South Everley, talking about things she wanted in a design so that she could access cultural resources, and the engineer was trying to solve a problem around contaminated land. And the design outcome would not have happened without the two of them there. Neither of them could come up with the innovative idea by themselves, but the fusion of their discussion created the idea. I'll go to regeneration first. So regeneration for us, sustainability is not working. It isn't. We must have positive effect. Sustainability is a gradual decay. It is a emeritus, approach, but we must now be having a positive effect. So how can country help show us that if we have a positive effect on how we design places and how we interact and how we occupy space? And then the last one is, you'll put that all together, the responsibility of legacy as designers is immense. future generations rely on us being smart about this and understanding and taking the best thoughts that we can to bring together to create a legacy for future. But we are also all, you know, parents, sons, brothers, sisters, cousins, and we hope that in many cases when we work on these projects, and I've got young staff, I don't know if any of you've got Gen Z staff in your office, they're very bit impatient, right? They're like, why are we doing this thing? It's not going to happen for 20 years. And I said, well, at least you might see it. But that is incredibly important when we think about legacy, but also that is also about, sometimes that legacy is not about things that, some things we need to last for a long time, or some things need to be able to continue to be used for lots of things. Change. How do we take I'm sorry if any heritage people in the room, but how do we take old buildings and transform them and use them and ensure those materials continue on? How do we design places now and practices so those things happen? So these are the pillars for us that we use. The other thing we talk about is this opportunity to think about being within country. The geology that, we think about the Canberra, this amazing geology that sits here that also, its combination with water creates the unique ecology, how the wind and all the things that surround us and the amazing cosmology and the sun and the moon in the sky, that we are within this system. And I often heard old uncle talk about that every time we breathe in and out, we are participating in the system of country. And that's sort of thinking about that systems thinking is being driven by an approach to country. And again, for us, when we design, recently we were working at Barangaroo, we're designing a space there, and at the beginning we went there before the sun came up, and one of the things we noticed about this place that was very unique to it is, as that particular part, because it faces the west, as the sun rose and it heated up the water at a certain thing, the difference in temperature between the city edge and the water created this soft westerly breeze almost at the same time every morning. And so we started to think about, well, how do we design this place? Even the lighting and everything we design are reflective, that they don't disturb non-human kin. They look at moon cycles so that we don't disturb the seahorses, the invertebrates, that we actually make it a light refuge. And so the light engineers thinking about, well, non-human kin as lighting, but also safe. Obviously we need to make it safe, but we can do these things together. Often we go to the first thing. So this idea of an element of country is, how can we think and understand the values that surround us and our opportunity as under those pillars to design in a way that we impact those positive outcomes. Oh, what's happened? Oh, there we go. So just to big note ourselves a bit? Nah, not really. I have had the great privilege of being involved in some early concept discussions in a number of projects in Canberra. And again, I think we work with amazing design colleagues, and how do you think about just a different lens, a new lens to a place? So we often think about what is the unique opportunity of a particular project, and how can it be thinking about its place in country? And so this is interesting. At Canberra Theatre, we came together with some amazing architects, and we were talking about, all the things you have to have, even about where's the parking going to be and how you're going to drive in there and all the things that are very important in Canberra. For us, we thought about, this is a topography that hosted that communication that I talked about before, that cultural practice. And we were thinking about, how do we have that again understood, but then also how do people who maybe come here, and we even thought about the theatre, the way that you walk onto the theatre as a performer. How do you, normally you walk down a concrete corridor, how do you have an experience of being spoken to by the traditional custodians and allowing to acknowledge the place that you're on? So you may come from across the world and perform at the Canberra Theatre, but hopefully the nice thing you do is you take home an experience of being looked after. So we looked at designing principles that sat within the master plan for this, and they were generated around this discussion of what this as a theatre could do and what it should do as helping communicate the things that surround them in Canberra. So even the theatres themselves, we've discussed their materiality, the experience, and we would go and view a performance, and it's almost like you're in a clearing and there are trees behind you, and that firelight only goes so far up. And when you sit in a theatre, it's the same thing. It's a place of light and shadow. So even not just the very literal, but almost just the experience, the immersive experience of how you move through this space, how the landscape is carved. So when you walk through the space, you'll feel like you're seeing the materiality of the geology, you're seeing the action of water as the architect. The this was an approach we did for a competition recently, and the reason I wanted to put this up is if we think about Canberra, very interesting, right? We had this lake behind us. That river still flows, that incredibly important cultural landscape still flows beneath that lake. And I think if I could offer something, we often get involved in this idea is if you're going to look at things such as water-sensitive urban design and all that sort of stuff, how do these things mesh also with cultural practice and cultural resource? So we're working in some spaces where we're doing restoration of hydrology with traditional custodians so that then that becomes the organising basis about where things are placed. So we have both a cultural and a social and an ecological connection to water. And so if I think about the lake, it's a bit of a funny one, right? Because it doesn't, it covers up the thing that should have been celebrated as being the unifying part. And so I know that they were very engaged in the natural landscape, but there was also this sort of way of seeing it. And so we would like to, both the function as a cultural place, but its ecological function. And it's interesting because, I mean, the wetlands now do function well, but they're sort of an outcome of the lake. But even though I find the edge of the lake is not a natural engagement, and the same when we're working in Sydney Harbour, people can't see the tides. The tides are underneath all of the landscape. And so people don't get that opportunity to see the voice of country amplified and have that opportunity to almost connect to the vibration of place that people feel and see. So we were really in this competition just trying to think about how could we allow people to see in a different way and to see that river, because that river is still there, but also understand its cultural place. So across the road here, we worked with the National Film and Sound Archive and looking at a draft master plan about the landscape around it, within it. But then we also worked on the sustainability strategy to turn it into a discussion around custodianship. And we talked about the National Film and Sound Archive as having this custodial role for the stories, contemporary stories of Australia, which they do. You know, I go in there and it's pretty scary. I see all the things that I used to walk around with, like a Walkman and that sort of stuff, and the types of music that I used to listen to in excess. But we sort of put it to them that, well, that's part of your role as custodianships, but your sustainability strategy should be about custodianship as well. And it's only that discussion about that, but then also how can we transform the landscape around that so that it also becomes a functional place. It talks to the landscape that it sits within, it honours it, and also it creates refuge for our non-human kin. We worked on the Woden campus, and there'd been a bunch of work done prior to us coming on there, and we worked closely with the landscape architecture team and the architects. And so there was many things that were brought forward around what was important about the things you should witness and see to remind you of this place that you're within country. So the building itself, which is being built right now, has this amazing approach to thinking about travelling the ridgeline, and that when you're coming up through the building, it has these winter gardens so that you can see out, so the students can sit in a space that they are engaging with elements, both the far distant colours and contrast of the brindabellas into the sky, but then also very intimate micro understanding. So we like to sort of give people the opportunity to see the vastness of country, but then also in many cases just those incredibly minute details of patterns that come from on the underneath of certain species of leaves or other things. And we're working on a bit of a project now, being asked to start thinking about this reimagining of Telstra Tower, which I find interesting because I suppose as growing up in Canberra, we always knew it from a few different names. Some of them were not very complimentary. And also I think as kids, we all used to get dragged up there, and then I think at some stage, I'm sure I went to something in a revolving restaurant up there. So, but of course, that landscape is amazing, you know, this sedimentary sandstone piece, and again, the opportunity to show people an understanding of richness, of deep down into country, what is around them, what are things they can understand to inspire them. So just, again, trying to think about how is the opportunity to use this very big brutalist thing. We've got a lot of brutalist things in Canberra. To have it have a function within country. How can it talk to engage in country, and also allow people to get a new understanding, but create a platform for community as well. So this is, again, just all conceptual ideas that have happened. There was previous work discussing this, and I suppose we're sort of being part of this, bringing towards some conceptual ideas about what could be possible. And then a weird one we work on, I say a weird one, a couple of streets that as a young man working in civic, my first job in Canberra was as an Aboriginal trainee at the Prime Minister's Department when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister in 1988. Interesting, started Landcare obviously. How do you, and it's, I think, segueing into, how people walk and move through Canberra is a really interesting thing. When I think about it, I work in Sydney a lot, and it's very contained, and there is, still opportunity to see through Canberra. Sometimes the things you see you might not want to see, but my only problem is that they're very straight. So how do we create more organic edge to this grid, to these lines that have been drawn? But we are working on a project now as a landscape architect to talk about, well, what can streets hold and how can they function in a way that also offer an interstitial space, an interstitial experience of country, but that also is a spatial experience of country. And so this is, as an idea, a provocation, we're thinking about how do you want people to enjoy elements and hopefully put their phones down and maybe look up into this beautiful sky and see the richest blue sky that you'll ever see in the whole of Australia. So I would like to thank you. I mean, we often think about our approach, but one of the questions we always ask ourselves is, what sort of ancestor do I want to be? And that's, at our team, we often reflect on that and hope. And again, very thankful because they are always around us. We have our own version of karma, and if you're thinking in the right way, and I had a lot of time working in national parks and working in some very sensitive places with some communities, and we're always told as long as you were speaking to them, they hear you and they look after you. And they often also help guide your hand and hopefully guide our hands when we're doing these designs. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. We have time for one question, so I might ask you to stay up the front. I wanted to ask, if the Griffins had co-designed with country, would Canberra be even better?
True question. It's interesting, they designed a suburb, is it Castle Cray? Look, I'm really bad on it. Yeah. In Sydney, which has got some amazing relationships between landscape and residential houses. But of course it would be better, because I think the thing growing up as a young man in country, here in Ngunnawal country, and my grandmother and my mother and my two younger brothers are cared for and buried here in Ngunnawal country, is that you didn't get to see it. It wasn't acknowledged in the form, the textures, the places, or also the experience and the access to significant landscapes. We're pretty lucky. It is better than, say, maybe in Sydney, where I lived in Canberra. I could still walk up from my place and go over the top of Mount Taylor to walk over to my grandparents' house over in Mawson. So that opportunity to go out there. But I think it would function better. I think ecologically it would be more resilient. But that would also make us have greater well-being, because in this day, the one thing we need to be well is being connected. The problem is most of us think that means being connected to people, but what we're offering is that if you're connected to country, you've got all these other things, and sometimes you can be disconnected from people, which is nice as well. So I think we talk about the bush capital, and I think it has amazing fabric, but I think, imagine, if Walter and Marion had got to sit down with the traditional custodians that are here with us today and have a yarn about where should we put things? How should the ancestors guide them to placing the things where we take our children to learn, where we look after our people so that they become well again, where we take our people so that they can rest. All those things I think would have been an amazing thing, and I'm pretty sure that they would have listened. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian. I'll move on to our second speaker now. So we have Dr. Julian Raxworthy. Dr. Julian Raxworthy is a registered landscape architect and urban and regional planning student. His most recent book is entitled Overgrown: Practices Between Landscape Architecture and Gardening, published in 2018 by the MIT Press. His current research for a book provisionally entitled Latent City: The Landscape Architecture of Land Tenure concerns the intersection between ideology, land ownership, natural systems and design. Welcome to the stage, Julian. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I'm a bit daunted to speak to a room of planners as a planning student. I began studying planning as a COVID qualification at UNE, and I'm yet to finish it. Although I'm close. And so what I'm going to talk about today quickly is really about some of the things about Canberra particularly that interest me around the road reserve. And so one of the things that I've been involved with as a landscape architect is that I'm interested in history and theory of landscape, and for my sins I'm a bit of a have expertise in relationship to the French garden, which is a kind of weird thing to be involved with. But I did grow up in Sydney, and my stepfather lived in Canberra, and so some of my earliest memories are actually coming to Canberra and being blown away by bike paths and concrete bridges and suburbia. And so, this image on the left here is a really interesting mapping that was undertaken by some people at the architecture school at Versailles, who were looking at the way that the landscape of Versailles overlaid existing land tenure systems and cultural systems related to landscape, which you can see in that sort of shadowing underneath. And so I've been really interested in the idea that anything we see about landscape in capitalism is actually made by land tenure. And so land tenure drives what landscape is these days. And now obviously, from our last speaker, fantastic, honoured to hear that presentation, we know that that's the real system that's operating here, those cultural and natural systems. But in capitalism, it is actually the fact that the space of landscape is created through land tenure. And so I started to realise this when I was working in practice in suburbia and started to see, in actual fact, I was working in the residual spaces of land tenure. And I thought, if we want to treat landscape seriously, we have to start to deal with land tenure. But contradictorily, I'm also really interested in form because I'm that sort of generation. And so some of the excitement with Canberra is around that formal dimension. And in a way, that diagram on the right there is, that's from QGIS, from Act Mappy, saying, that's the land tenure arrangement that makes the figure of the city. Now, I arrived back to Australia after having been in South Africa for 5 years, and then, followed my wife to Dubai for 2 years. And in that sort of, including a stint in the States, in that 10 years, a lot has changed. But what was really interesting to me is sort of, coming back during COVID, being in the other part of the world where friends were dying from COVID, and, it was a very intense time. And in a way, when I reappeared through this sort of aperture of hotel quarantine, the first thing I did for this new job I had at UC was to turn up in Canberra. And I turned up in this place, which is 17 Randell Street in Dixon, which was an Airbnb. And I was really interested, and I instantly saw the fact that, densification was happening in Dixon. And I was really interested in the contribution that trees made to that. Because I'm a tree guy. I studied at Ryde College of Horticulture before I did landscape and I was a landscape contractor, and I trained as a tree surgeon. And so I really started to appreciate that if it weren't for those trees, densification would not be able to be so smoothly incorporated into the new city. And so I started to really begin to appreciate the fact that in a way, the size of the road reserve set up the arrangement of trees that allowed for a later densification to occur. And so I suddenly realised that land tenure is also about the future. It's about latency and not resilience, because I agree resilience is not a great word, but nonetheless some contingency. And when we look at this document on the right, this is for my sins, I'm a history guy. This is by a guy called Harry Oakman. His archive is at UQ, where I did my PhD. And, he talked at that time when he wrote the landscape guidelines for the new NCDC, he talked about the idea that road reservation widths have reached some degree of standardisation, ensuring sufficient screening space for contiguous buildings. Now, they weren't contiguous buildings when he was putting those, considering what they were going to be. So he was considering how in the future actually those trees might buffer densification. And so these two images, the one from before and the one from after, show us how that process played out and the investment that the public decision of Road Reserve made. As a landscape architect, I was a collector of books. My parents were both historians. And I found this book really fascinating by Edna Walling called The Australian Roadside. And she was, obviously an outstanding Australian arts and crafts garden designer, early protagonist in the emerging bush garden and native plant scene in Australia. And here we see her on the right, having a cup of tea, driving along roads and recognising that actually roads were going to be the place where biology and botany and conservation were going to occur. Now, it seems like it's a far cry from where we are now in these urban situations, yet I would argue that we have little control over the public lot, but we have a lot of control over the road reserve, and so it still is actually that residual space of biology. Now, and so the road reserve is interesting to me because of I think it jumped a slide, yep. So, I wrote this book called Overgrown, and really what it's about is, my journey from being left school at 15, landscape contractor and gardener, and then eventually becoming a landscape architect. And as I would say, when I was a gardener and a landscaper, I'd work without representation. I'd work in real time. I'd experience the environment. I'd get rained on, put the tally-ho paper out and see if it got enough drops to go inside. All of those things, but in that time it wasn't about representation, it wasn't about drawings, it was about immediacy. But then when I became a landscape architect, suddenly I'm representing the world, I'm further away from its reality. And so I find this book was really me trying to work out how to bring those two sides together and recognise that for landscape, change is the core of it, as we heard from the last speaker. Change is its very nature, and that transformation is part of its continuous onward movement. Yet, how do we work with it in this static way when we're working with drawings, when we're working with finite documents in prediction? Now, ironically, I've made the case that planning is a time-based discipline in the way that architecture and landscape aren't, because it's actually contingent and triggered around policies that move and change. Now, awful lot of text in there, too much for me probably, but nonetheless, I think it's actually quite a good mechanism in its own way for dealing with transformation. And so here's a couple of images that show that even in the most banal streetscapes, there is processes happening. I did a study on Ainslie as part of an article I was writing called The Hedges of Ainslie that really looked at what was happening in those road reserve spaces. And we see that in that image of the famous bus shelter, it's been painted. There's a swing hanging in the street tree. Someone's parked a rather nice car illegally in the road reserve there. And in the bottom, we see that both people are utilising and collecting these trees, but also that those introduced species, and that's basically an oak forest that's coming up on its own in a nature strip there. So we're in this hybrid sort of bastard ecology that we're working within, and it's sort of rich, scary, and it has its own momentum. And I think that's an interesting thing about the road reserve. And they work hard, They've got to move people. They've got to have amenity. They've got a major environmental resource, even when we don't see them. They've got to do all the things about essentials. This is a terrible image produced by ChatGPT on the right, by the way. When I said, produce me a really quick image that's got lots of services and bins and stuff in it quickly, but make sure the cars are on the left-hand side of the road. And so, obviously, crucially in Canberra, it's also access to leases. And so, in a way, it does a lot. It really does a lot, the road reserve. Now, I'm a digital guy as well, a bit of a nerd, and so, one of the things that's fascinating to me is, in a way, to think about that space of the street as this residual space left over by planning, where, in a way, how we tweak the small things that have to be in that space has a huge amount of what the experiential, ecological opportunities of that are. And so the street section is not simply just a kind of planning thing, it's the space you occupy when you move. And so, in Grasshopper and Rhino here with my students, some of whom have joined me here, today, thank you. We've tried to explore how different configurations of policy and textual things that we might know from planning, how they manifest themselves, and try to work with them parametrically to sort of say, what tweak do we do here? What does that affect, I think one of the key things to note is, and I'll make an argument against, which is that I'd argue for a bigger road reserve and no setback, but that's just me. And so for my sins, in preparation for this, I decided to utilise some of the GIS that I was studying at UNE and spent like 5 nights without sleep trying to get a map that measured all of the road reserve averages across Canberra. And I was expecting to find that in actual fact the road reserves had got less over time. But what I discovered is that in actual fact the road reserves haven't gone less, and we're talking a lot of the time about differences of 1.5 metres, 2 metres in those widths. But there's enormous differences in what happens in those spaces. And so that's not something that I've got an answer to, but it's a really interesting observation that I think it's not actually just about that width as I suspected, and damn you research for not proving my historical point. But nonetheless, it's interesting. Almost done here. So I think the key thing is that, it's about room to move. And so if we compare, say, a 20-metre road reserve, which was the one I was staying in Dixon, to the one that we, the one that I found randomly by looking at 16 and 17-metre road reserves in my GIS exercise. This is one, Liz O'Neill Street in Casey. What you really discover is actually that it's other factors that conspire with the road reserve to really change how that performs. And so, I've been, one of the great things you get to do when you teach is you get to work with, talented young people. You get to vicariously do research through/with them. And, you try not to own their outcomes too much, even if you feel proud of them. And so one of my students, Ramona Hoffler, who's at Oculus, you may know her. She's a really brilliant landscape architect. I encouraged her to consider how we might work with the fabric of the city to try to sort of retrofit vegetation into it in a kind of rule-based model from planning. And so one of the terms we came up with was this idea of the treesment, which is a kind of way of trying to incorporate into a planning code ideas about tree location. Obviously, some of those have changed in the latest revision there. And so I think one of the things that is interesting is, you can't beat a 30-metre road reserve. And so, this is an interesting moment in a way to acknowledge that nature does take space and nature will prosper from space. And we have that really interesting contradiction in Canberra between this sort of ever-present natural space that was probably the contribution of the Griffins in understanding from a distance some aspect of topography, and also this sort of really strict geometry. And it's between those two that I think is the possibility, and probably that my only suggestion would be that perhaps the lease system offers an opportunity for us to reach more deeply into private property, which is not actually that private, to allow us to achieve other environmental outcomes. Thanks.
Thanks again, Julian. We have a little bit of time for questions, so I might ask you to come back up again. I'll open it to, so we have about 10 minutes. I'll open it to the audience if anyone wants to jump up and ask a question.
To both of us as well?
Well, we'll leave Christian until the Q&A, but if you just want to have 10 minutes for questions, if anyone had any. Yep.
There's a big, hi. Well,
Hi.
It's great. It's good to see Griffin having a go.
Thank you. I try.
A big push on our communities now is about urban heat, and when you look at Western Sydney, a bit different to, well, maybe Canberra in the summer. I haven't had one of those for a while, but when you look at the heat that's built up in our cities and the push for wider road reserves, what's your call there? And is it just simply wider is better, or do we need to think more about the problem? Because a lot of councils are pushing now for 4.5 wide reserve verges, not 3.5, and on the developer front, that takes about 10, 15, 20% off our yield, so we're part-time about that. Then you've got the push on housing affordability, so it's all coming at you from different angles. So,
Well, yeah, as I say, I'm a student planner. I'm just a landscape architect, really. But I mean, my argument would be here that really, actually, we should get rid of the setback, because in a way, if you look at what's happened, and again, I use Dixon because I was in quarantine around there, and I got to spend a bit of time. What was really interesting is that you've got a really strong road reserve with a lot of mature trees. It's quite a decent size. Then you've got the setback, and then you've got the underground parking taking up the back of the lot. Now, the trees will cast enough shade that the trees in the front yard will never actually get to a decent height because they're being shaded out by the street trees. No one's ever going to sit in the front yard because, let's face it, we're private people in Australia. We chew up the backyard with hardstand to put the parking underneath. And so in a sense, we've kind of used the setback as this token landscape space that doesn't do any function, that doesn't get used. So I'd almost do this thing where I'd go wider road reserve, zero setback, and then enforce this treesment on the lot to say, and let's now get some trees on the lot. So maybe you sacrifice, you in a way gain some by loss of the setback, and then you have specific things like 2 lots converge their setbacks from the centre to create a volume on the boundary that they can put a decent 2 trees in, or things like that. So I'd be more inclined to sort of work on the inside of the lot and think about those sort of gains. But in terms of heat island, obviously it's about hard surface and albedo and factors like that. And obviously the best thing we have to deal with that is trees. And so I think this is where, we are at a point with parking. I don't need all planners, I don't need to tell you around this question. Everyone would like, yesterday we were talking about it, everyone would rather, I'm a bike rider, we only have one car household, but that car still needs to be parked somewhere. And so I do think that that in a way it's about bringing things like convergence of driveways into one shared area and doubling the size on streets. And I think there's a lot of kind of tricks. But so I think, yes, maybe one-way streets rather than 2-way streets, take a lane out. I mean, I think that there are tricks in design that might solve some of those things. But yeah, there's, this is why, I focused in this on urban residential rather than arterial roads, because ultimately this idea that all of our conservation happens in big parks is not actually broad spread enough for us to get the environmental things we need. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
Just as a bit of a comment picking up on that, and the idea, I think in Canberra lately, subdivisions are tending to be, street trees tend to be a lot smaller.
Yeah.
A lot less problematic to maintain. We're not getting the oaks and the eucalypts that Ainslie has.
Yeah.
And also with some of the recent rule changes with minimum open space within the blocks, it seems to be that we're pushing the trees onto private care and private residential.
Yeah.
That doesn't guarantee that we're going to get any big trees.
No, absolutely. No, it doesn't, no.
So, how do we push that back? I mean, I like the idea of the bigger verge, but
I mean, I think I think that in a way in those public streets, we definitely, I was talking to somebody recently about, I'm a crepe myrtle guy, but I'm not a crepe myrtle guy for a street tree. Like, let's get real here, And so, we need to focus on environmental performance of shade and big trees. So I suppose I would be saying maybe you work on some concessions in the lot, and then you actually just focus more on forcing some tree outcomes in the street to that answer. So I suppose all I'm saying is that's a wrong tree. These small trees are the wrong sort of trees, and I mean obviously people are terrified of shade, and to the in some sort of sense, but yeah, we've got to think long term about it.
We've got time for one more question, if anyone has one.
How do you, your answer there about having slightly bigger road reserves and smaller setbacks, just building on that, how do you start to, and something Canberra, I guess, for people that live in Sydney and Melbourne, Canberra sort of seems to have this, some people would see it as an issue, some would see it as a benefit, but an issue about activating streets and making them feel, places for people. I guess, one of the things driving around Canberra's suburbs as somebody who lives in Sydney is the beautiful avenues of trees, but the complete lack of people and activation.
I wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't agree with that. I'm one of these evil people who chose to buy an 800 square metre block in Hackett, and so bona fide a Hackett greenie or something. But what's interesting about that is that I've never had a more social street that I've lived in my life. I met my neighbours within days. Like he's got a really robust. I know everybody. I grew up in Newtown, in Camperdown, in Bishopsgate Street, so in the 70s. So I can tell you that I've got more community in my big, sprawling suburban Canberra than I've ever had in anywhere I've lived before. And so I think in actual fact, this is about our perception of what, we kind of got this European orthodoxy around density and activation. I don't think it's actually always true. Australia's different, and I think that what's nice about Canberra, I do think it has to densify, there's no doubt. But I think in a way, with the way we understand activation is, like these kind of urban design diagrams of like people holding balloons and, all that stuff. But in actual fact, people in wheelchairs and, accessible and all that stuff. But in actual fact, activation is maybe a communication, community engagement, and maybe it's a bit more ad hoc than that, And like, I just have power tools, screaming kids. Like, I'm in the biggest amount of space with the most amount of activity. Di Firth, when I first arrived, said Canberrans always use their backyards as the space to have every landscape hobby and thing they ever had there, So I think in actual fact it's a different type of activation, maybe.
Thanks so much, Christian and Julian, for your presentations. That concludes the first half of our event today. We're about to break for lunch. I think it's maybe in the process of being served, but we'll come back at 1:15 this afternoon for the second half. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, while people are finding their seat, I'm just going to share a story about why I'm a planner. I've been a planner for a couple of decades, in and out, but always a planner. My nana, Christian mentioned his nana. Yeah, do sit down while I'm talking. My nana and my grandfather brought me to Canberra when I was 11, and we stood on Old Parliament steps, and I said to my wonderful nana, "Nana, who did all this?" And she looked at me, and my grandmother was always the expert on everything, and she said, "Mac, it was some really smart people." And I think at the age of 11, I thought I wanted to be one of those smart people who planned this great city. So that was my first introduction to Canberra, and I think it's why I've stayed with the planning profession. So we're about to sit down, and we're going to hear from Hitomi on how we can have sustainable transportation in this city. Now, Hitomi is a transport and infrastructure planning expert. She's a member of Transport Australia Society ACT Committee. She's also Women in Transport on the Women in Transport Working Group, Transport Australia Society, and Planning Institute of Australia. In addition, and this is amazing, I think she's extraordinary. She's a global citizen, as so many of you are. She is on the Japanese Society of Civil Engineering, the City Planning Institute of Japan, and the Architectural Institute of Japan. Her research involves using multidisciplinary approaches to examine human behaviours, including travel choices and mobility, in perspectives of land use, urban form and infrastructure planning for smart cities. She developed an evaluation system of urban and regional policy and infrastructure development from the viewpoint of social and environmental sustainability and the quality of life. She's also focused on transport behavioural changes and urban models, which she has published internationally. This has led to extensive collaboration with industry. She's also engaged in research representing the urban infrastructure development under climate change. She uses digital tools such as agent-based modelling and GIS. Please welcome Hitomi. Up you come.
I think I'm using this microphone. It's a little bit weird to wear one microphone and then using another one. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm Maxine and also Nicole and also peer community. I'm very pleased to see my graduates from UC. We were running our planning degree. We still got the degree, but we are not taking new students. So very pleased to see some of my graduates in this role. Thank you so much. I would like to acknowledge the Noa people for the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting and pay respect to the elders of Noa Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. So I'm talking about transport, but we cannot separate transport from our land use. And Canberra has been transforming very dynamically in the last 111 years. And one thing that Griffin couple had in their mind was streetcar, which we now call in our current words lightly, and we are actually implementing this very strongly. So how our travel mode share changed? This is the census data in the last the nearly last 18 years. And the reality is that we haven't changed much, unfortunately. That we see the drop of car as a percent. Sorry, this is the journey to work data, by the way. And in 2021, we see the decline of 5% of the car as a driver passenger, but this is mainly due to working from home. We are not really giving up cars. We are using cars. And use of public transport, dropping using public transport is from the same reason. We are working from home more than 2016, or working from home is basically our new sort of style of working since COVID. So, reality is that we haven't really changed our model sheets yet. How we are using light rail? We had, because of the bonus from ACT government, we had free ride in April in 2019. So we really enjoyed the free ride. We are actually now enjoying the free ride now. I'm really impressed how ACT government is generous in terms of giving free ride. So please use public transport now. And yes, so we have been using relatively well. Yes, that big drop in April 2020. And also August to October 2021 is from the lockdown. But after excluding the COVID time, we have been using light rail relatively well. And so people like light rail. This is evident from the data, but this is unfortunately applies to the northern side of Canberra because we don't have light rail yet extended to the southern part. And the good news is that we just started to have more electronic vehicles on the road in terms of reducing our emissions. And ACT is actually a champion in using, in terms of passenger electronic vehicle. But we still need to do a lot of work for us to actually use EVs as our daily car. Or even the autonomous car is still, we need to do a lot of work before that. But it's happening, it's happening. In Canberra, people form their driving habit. Driving is one behavior which is called habit. We are actually, the driving is habitual behavior. And this model is based on my research, interviewed the baby boomers generation. So they are now in their 70s, but this model still applies to the younger generations. So, of course, when we are a teenager, we are a child, we don't drive by ourselves. People create their driving habit when they have families. They got children, basically, because of the need of a necessity to drive their kids to kindies or childcare or school. And once we created this driving habit, it's very difficult for us to give up because now we drive to everywhere. And also Canberra is very easy to drive. And this is how this is this model is based on my interviews with more than 100 parents in Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra. And among this data, more than 50 are from Canberra parents. Basically, type A is a very typical behavior of Canberra's family. So everyone gets on the car and they drive to school or childcare, drop one kid at childcare, drop another one in school, and go to work. And after 3, mom or dad picks one of the child from childcare and another one from school. And quite often, they go to soccer or dance lesson or piano lesson with kids. And after that, we go to Coles or Woolies to have some groceries and go home. This is a very typical behavior of us. And just in case if people from Melbourne and Sydney are here, Type B and Type C are very interesting for me, but also very typical, the model of people in Melbourne and Sydney. Because they cannot take their cars to work, they drive their kids to school, come back to home, and they take public transport to work, or they sometimes cycle to transport station and then take public transport to work, and come home and take car and pick up kids from school. This is typical in Melbourne, Sydney. Type D is seen in inner area of Canberra, like Lynham, Turner. If children are independent enough to cycle or walk to their own school by themselves, they do. With parents either cycle or walk to work, or they take car to work. And I also did a research on how our behavior or attitudes are different among generations. Sorry if you're baby boomers, but baby boomers have a probably the worst habit of driving car, because when they became independent, car was a symbol of freedom or their status. And this still exists in Generation X, but from millennial or Generation Y or probably Gen Z, they see car as just one of the transport mode, not really a symbol of freedom or status. There's still some, but not majority. However, we are yet to know if these younger people, younger generations, may shift to car-oriented behavior. And this is largely to do with our built environment and also how they raise kids. They are currently fond of train, car, bike, walk, and also now e-bikes or the e-scooters. They really love it. But after they have a child, I don't know yet if they're gonna shift to the to still keep multimodal behavior, or they may completely shift to car-oriented lifestyle. I don't know yet. And so before the key thing is before they generate this car driving habit, we need to have a integrated land use and transport system very well prepared for them. And the dilemma is that I'm not saying that we should all get rid of car. We need to drive. We need to drive to help our older parents. We need to drive for our children. But we can probably choose not to use cars all the time. And the dilemma is that sometimes I call this captive driver. We sometimes need to drive. We cannot give up driving in all occasions, but we can be a choice multimodal, or we can be a choice driver sometimes. And this is, I think, that Canberra needs to aim for. And we all know in this floor that what the concept of transit-oriented development. It's if we could have more dense mixed-use land use in busy area of the city, and then we run rapid transport system in between, we can reduce car use and associated CO2 emissions, and also traffic congestion, ideally. And what I think I would like to say is we learn, so we got, and this is already happening in Canberra, but we sort of focus on consulate and our city functions, admin functions, education, commercial functions in higher or mid-dense or high-dense area, and then we run the environmentally friendly and people-friendly transport system, and then we cycle or use bus when we need, and also I really like that we can put our bike in light rail, which I do sometimes. And I am coming from a country where 98% of children either walk or cycle to school. We can do this with reduced the speed in the school zones and also training of children. And I would like to see more children walking or cycling to school independently, so that also the parents don't need to hustle every morning. So yeah, and also autonomous vehicle. It's coming, but we need to take a bit more time. So that's I think that's it from me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Any one question? We'll have the panel, but yeah.
Hi, Jamie. Do you have much data on, like, the actual distance to school? Like, for example, the journey, you say, compared to Japan, it's like 90%. How far are those children travelling independently compared to what they would be travelling in Australia?
Yeah, so around 5K. So 5K or less than 7 to 8K. That's the maximum. And I did some research using GIS. So in Canberra, if you're going to local school, children are going to school within their 5K radius. But the problem is that traffic safety concerns very high here because yes, the car is running with 80K speed with the children are walking. So yes, and also the easiness for parents, which really understand, but rather than concerning about their children's safety every day, it's probably mentally very calm for them to drive them, even the distance is shorter. So yes, that's actual data. Yes.
Thank you very much. And again, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and now we're to our final, but not, of course, not the least speaker, Matt Collins. Matt is the CEO of the Planning Institute, also referred to, as you've heard today, as PIA. He's a recognised leader in urban planning and policy. He's a member of the National Urban Policy Forum, and remember that because I hope you ask him a question about it. That forum advises the Minister for Cities on key national urban issues. Before joining PIA, Matt led Queensland's Treasury Cities Transformation Task Force, playing a pivotal role in negotiating the $1.8 billion South East Queensland city deal. Maybe a question to him was, how do we get one for Canberra? He's a qualified planner. He's advised senior ministers across the infrastructure, transport planning and local government portfolios. His experience spans both public and private, and in those various roles, he's consulted with major firms on projects relating to planning, infrastructure and city making. So Matt's going to tell you why planning is so pivotal for solving our wicked problems. Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much, Maxine, and I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly thank Wally for that wonderful rite of passage and smoking ceremony this morning. Also acknowledge Natalia Anderson, our peer president here in the ACT, and also Nicole Gurran leading the Henry Halloran Trust, which has made today's really interesting discussion possible. As you heard, I'm the CEO of the Planning Institute of Australia. Essentially, all you need to know about us for now is that we're the peak body for planning and planners. And it's really great to join you today because it's actually World Cities Day. So it's a perfect time for this conversation about wicked problems in this public city. But before I talk about some of those wicked problems, I want to change gears a bit because not only is today World Cities Day, it's also Halloween. So I want to start with a scary story. And like all horror stories, there's a kernel of truth in it. In fact, it's all true, and that's what makes it scary. It's a story about the North American black bear, the kind that weighs up to about 300 kilos, can run up to about 50 kilometres an hour, the kind you really don't want to meet if they're hangry. Stay with me, I promise this is actually relevant to today's topic. Back in 2004, a libertarian movement in the USA started what they called the Freetown Project. and essentially took over the town of Grafton in New Hampshire. The Libertarians didn't want much of government at all. It's an impediment to liberty and freedom. And so the Free Town Project was a bit of an experiment in rolling back the frontiers of government to let individuals in a free market find the solutions to their local problems. And Grafton was particularly attractive for this project and for the libertarian movement because the town already had low property taxes and, better yet, no zoning regulations. And so the Libertarians took over a period of about 5 years. They had a surge of 200 new residents, Libertarians who moved there. It was a small town, that's how they could take over. And over that time, government was rolled back. And the good citizens of Grafton, they were more free to do what they wanted as individuals. And of course, without zoning, they were free to build where they wanted to. And this influx of new residents and growth drove new residents outside the town boundaries and into the habitat of the black bear. You might be able to start to know where this is going. Of course, the Grafton Libertarians also didn't much like the idea of paying for bear-proof bins, let alone having the council mandate it, big government. Some of the new residents even thought they were free and should feed the bears, which they did. So, of course, the bears found the garbage bins to be a convenient source of food. They also started to become bolder and more aggressive, and they actually began roaming the town. And this culminated in 2012 when there was a black bear attack, the first bear attack in New Hampshire in more than 100 years. Now, I'm sharing this story not because I think it's a plausible future for Canberra, but because to me it shows the unintended consequences that we should bear in mind and the dangers of absolute certainty, particularly in the absolute certainty of any ideology. Also, of course, because in so many ways, Canberra is the antithesis of Grafton, New Hampshire. A modern exemplar of a planned, sub-centralised metropolitan development, to quote Smith, Quirk and Wright, with a profound legacy in planning, innovation and experimentation. Innovation and experimentation both in terms of the people who came here and shaped this city, starting of course with the Griffins, but also in the governance that government here designed to facilitate and shape the city itself, most notably the NCDC, but other forms of governance innovation as well. Now, of course, I need to confess I'm not a local. My knowledge of Canberra comes from afar, from being a frequent visitor and from also being a planner, reading the history of this remarkable bush capital, the most public of cities. And so as I reflect on the wicked problems which are shaping our seminar today, I can't help though but find inspiration in Canberra's history of experimentation and its legacy of planning by bold practitioners. One of the troubles though, when you want to talk about planning and think about planning, is it's not always easy to see. In fact, good planning tends to be invisible. The value of planning accumulates over time and tends to go unnoticed. Of course, you sure as hell notice bad planning, particularly when there's bears, but also in so many other ways as well. But it's good planning that ensures the right homes are in the right places, supported by the necessary infrastructure, services and amenities, and we know that when communities are well planned, they just work. But good planning requires a comprehensive approach. It's a place where people have to come together from all disciplines to consider the social, economic and environmental factors, and the act of integration is the task of planning itself. Now, our friends at the Royal Town Planning Institute in the UK recently published some work that sought to quantify the wider economic benefits of planning. Their research found that good planning could create up to $70 billion pounds of value over 10 years from the benefits that planning would bring through things like better connectivity, access to open space, and the productivity benefits of densification. Now, this was based on the UK government's ambition to build 300,000 new homes each year for the next decade. Now, anybody familiar with housing policy in Australia will know we have similar ambitions in this country, 240,000 new homes over the next 5 years. I wonder what additional value we could bring to that ambition with good planning and better planning, because after all, that is our role as planners and other practitioners as well, to help plan for the future and indeed the many futures that we might have. because that agility, that change is something that is constant. Charlie Hosch, a US planning academic, in his book, What Planners Do, said that planners compose and offer advice on preparing for an uncertain future. Because solving the wicked problems today that we have talked about, be they about land tenure, streetscapes, the need to be better custodians of the Murrumbidgee, the burning platform of sustainable transport and housing, or the need to imagine how we connect and design in a more country-centred way, these all need planning to act as an enabler. Not only to solve the crises we face today, as urgent as they are, but to also avoid the crises of the next generation as well. The kind of long-term imagination that has always characterised Canberra, in fact, more than most other places. The 1969 plan that some of you will be familiar with, Tomorrow's Canberra, envisaged a Y-shaped settlement pattern to support a population ultimately of 1 million Canberrans. 1969, at a time when the city had a population of about 125,000 people. More than 50 years later, you're still not at 1 million. But that kind of long-term imagination is what we need. Planners plan, they need to think about the needs of future generations. And if we want to solve wicked problems, we have to get back to that kind of boldness, that kind of ambition. At PIA, one of the things we're doing is trying to help the profession sort through what the futures may hold with some recent research that we released called the PIA Foresight Report. We published that a couple of months ago, and this is all about trying to anticipate the future trends that will not just shape planning, but the communities that planners plan for as well. Foresight's the act of thinking about the future so that we can better guide the decisions today. So it's not about predicting the future, it's really about anticipating the plausible futures that we might encounter. And what we tried to do in this report is set out those trends, 55 of them in total, based on a deep dive with the profession and experts beyond, to think about what we need to be anticipating for the future. We set that out over 3 time horizons: the urgent trends that need action now, the preparatory trends that where we need to build resilience in, and the monitoring trends, which are the most distant off, but we need to be observing them now and learning how they might shape our cities and places. And out of those 55 trends, I wanted to include some of the most pressing, the act now trends listed there, because these are the ones that we see requiring pressing action due to their significant impact and urgency. And I think listening to the discussion today, it's clear that many of these issues are already playing out locally here. The housing crisis, the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, infrastructure constraints, all trends we need to be dealing with now with a fierce sense of urgency. I don't purport to have the answers, but I know that a planning-led approach is going to be crucial. By definition, solving wicked problems isn't easy, but to me, we have to start by asking the right questions. So in closing today, I'd like to suggest that we go from wicked problems to wicked questions, because to me, there are some of the big questions that we need to be asking to help shape the future we want to see. Are we ensuring the right housing is in the right locations? How are we going to fund the infrastructure that's essential for great communities? Are the decisions that we are all making today and the city that we are shaping laying the foundation for the kind of Canberra you want at 1 million or even 2 million? What would it take for us to seriously think about how we plan with country in partnership with our First Nations peoples? How do we give the future a voice in engagement and consultation? And how do we reimagine the Canberra of our dreams, and how do we change and retrofit it to get there? During the recent ACT election, PIA here in Canberra started to share some of our answers with the start of a vision for Canberra. To us, that was about a place where planning embeds caring for country. We're planning for the bush capital is nature positive. We're planning creates sustainable urban and rural landscapes here in the ACT with reduced emissions that help us adapt to a changing climate. Where we're planning for movement in place, where there's a wider range of choices about where and how we live, and where the planning system is encouraging housing, including for the missing middle, balancing all of the infrastructure we need to support the growth that we are experiencing. Good planning to me is really the key to how we make any vision a reality, and it's the best tool that we have to bring people together to solve those wicked problems. Ultimately, I think there are some really big wicked problems before us. We've touched on just some of them, But I think if we ask any of you, you will think of your own as well. There is so much to do, and there's no time to waste. And I think it is essential that we get back to thinking bold and get back to planning with ambition. Thank you.
I won't offer a question for Matt, so Matt, could you stay and take a seat? And please, could the other speakers come up and we'll start the panel discussions. And I think Tom's going to... Yeah, Tom. Sorry, we right? Yeah, grab a seat, Christy. Okay. Tom and I are a tag team, so Tom's going to start off with a question from folk who sent one in online. And then put your hand up also too, if there's silence in the room, we'll just go back to those questions and we'll ask the audience to answer them. So there you go, encouragement to participate.
Thanks, Max. I think that's working now, yep. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your time today and taking time out of your schedules to talk. I think all of the presentations were fantastic and certainly got everyone thinking, so thank you for that. I wanted to start today with a question that was pre-submitted from our audience, and I think I've chosen it because I think climate change was probably a big theme that came through from pre-submitted questions. So I wanted to ask, what one thing do you think we could change in Canberra that would have the biggest impact on addressing climate change? And there's a second part. If the answer is to increase density and limit urban sprawl, how do we get better at selling this? Did you want to have a go at answering that, Julian? I guess.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I actually think it's a political question, and I think it's led by values. I think that to some degree, we, as built environment professionals, keep trying to mitigate something which is a public and political issue that needs to be engaged on a personal level. And so I keep thinking, yeah, there's lots of mitigation we can do, but in actual fact, really it's been a political issue the whole time. So yeah, I would, plant more trees, do more with water, learn from Indigenous people who understand managing landscape. But ultimately, it's been a failure of politics for a long time. And so to some degree, I mean, the jobs we do all contribute to the mitigation, but until there's a policy change that we're all part of in our election choice and in our daily choices at home, I think it's all a bit, the horse is bolted a little bit, and let's just do the best we can with what we've got. And we know those answers and have for a long time. That's just my...
Absolutely, thank you. And Christian, I guess everyone's mentioned so far the importance of incorporating designing for country with addressing climate change. Is there anything you wanted to add as well?
I think it's really interesting. We do a lot of work recently around looking at different models for social housing and alternative housing models. And I suppose when I first moved to Sydney, I used to think of towers and all these things as being the worst example of housing. But then now I see, the 800 square metre block where we mow 700 metres and it's called environmental living as being the thing in Australia we love. And so I think that the solutions are there, but they don't occur in the same place at the same time. And I think that being able to, because there is such a wealth of open space, I suppose being from a context of working in Western New South Wales where I was often surrounded by more animals than I was people, and then all of a sudden being thrust into the CBD to work on a project in Sydney. And I think, how do we make our buildings have a custodial role? How can they become, amazing, innovative, ecological machines that become regenerative? And then how do we as people celebrate our role in those? And how does that draw us together as community? We often talk about this idea of confluence of social, it's hydrosocial. There's a guy who works for me, his whole PhD is looking at the social values of, the water infrastructure in Sydney and thinking about, well, where does it occur and how does it, and that idea that we were so disconnected and when we're all connected to Wi-Fi, but we're so disconnected to each other. What is the opportunity for those things that we come together? And really interesting enough, water is one that comes back, but then types of spaces in different ways, and even sometimes even about how we experience other parts of the place that are around us in a new way, of things that connect us, and then again, we allow us. But at the moment, we reside in a way, and then we have so many people who don't have anywhere to live, and it's just not right in a country like this that we should be able to. So originally I used to think, this really dense housing, but imagine medium density that sits within topography and actually supports hydrological design, and then people can sort of, I work in national parks. Sorry if you're a cat owner, I'm not too keen on cats. I've seen some pretty scary cats when I worked in Kosciuszko. But that idea that we can have custodianship over the space we're in, but we can connect to each other through that.
Yeah, great. Hitomi and Matt, I'll let you both add something before we throw to some audience questions.
So transport contributes 70% of CO2 emissions. So this is a big problem. And however, changing Canberra's transport network to be able to support our chain trip that the parents, our family make every day takes time. So in the meantime, I would like to see some financial support from government for people who are going to replace their very old gas gathering cars to a newer one, or EVs or hybrid cars, or bonus to household who are going to give back having second car, so that we can at least reduce some CO2 emissions from transport sector itself. And in long term, I would like to see more active transport happening in Canberra, but this takes time.
I probably echo some of Julian's points. I think that ultimately we generally know the solutions to deal with climate change, to mitigate and adapt. The problem is one of political will and a failure of political systems to be able to do that. And of course, there's no one silver bullet. It's the accumulation of a whole series of interventions that will ultimately, other things being equal, get us where we need to get to. But that systemic failure of politics to get us there is a really big challenge for us to grapple with. And I think as built environment professionals, it probably speaks to an interesting question for us to ponder, which is, does it mean we need new skill sets? Does it mean we need to get better at leading urban change ourselves and taking communities on the journey that aren't always easy? Because political decision makers are rational beings as well. And if there is hesitance in indeed resistance in the community to the solutions that we are presenting as technical professionals, I do think it's incumbent on us to think about how we lead that change with the community as well. I don't purport to have the blueprint for that either, but I think we need to also think about how we build out those skill sets in all of us as built environment professionals so that we can create more space for the change that is so imperative.
Throwing it open to you folks. Richard, if you could just wait for the speaker because it's easier to record. Thanks.
Thank you. I come from, I'm one of the silent generation that you referred to, a highly endangered species. Since my retirement, I've been trying to overcome that hurdle by becoming something of a community advocate. But I must say, having worked most of my professional career in government, in the time that I was employed, planning was essentially seen as primarily a government activity. But over that time, and particularly more recently, I think, the bulk of planners, the majority of planners seem to work for the private sector and seem to have become advocates for particular development proposals. Now, Matt had a wonderful checklist there of the challenges for the planning profession, but I don't see that most planners are actually in a position to do much about that. They're not in government. They can't sort of directly influence the outcomes at a government level. How do you overcome that problem?
I think that's one for you, Matt.
Look, I mean, there is no doubt the planning profession has changed and evolved since it was first established. I think at the end of the day, though, working in the private sector doesn't necessarily mean, and in fact I'm convinced it shouldn't and doesn't, mean that planners as a profession should check their public interest ethos at the door. Because I think one of the things that makes professions, and I think the planning profession is included in this, distinct, is that it is underpinned by the public interest, regardless of where you work. And I think, doctors is an immediate example of where most of them work in the private sector as well, but are still driven by that public interest ethos. One of the things that we're doing is certainly seeking to elevate that through the work that we do around, in a narrow sense, the Code of Professional Ethics, but also more recently in work we're doing with our members around advocacy and putting public interest squarely at the centre of whatever we are advocating for. And I think that's fundamental. But at the end of the day too, in a more systems sense, I think what is really important for us to be focused on, both at the Institute and as a profession, is how we get the strategic planning right. Because ultimately, planners are all working within those strategic planning frameworks, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. Those frameworks sit across everything. And if we get those strategic frameworks right, and if we have government committed to them, then ultimately the development that flows from it can and should be in the public interest, because ultimately those strategic frameworks should be about delivering the public interest. That's the idea. Clearly there's work to do, but it's certainly something that we're committed to doing.
Another question, comment? Miranda here.
Thank you all for your presentations. It's been really, really fascinating. My name is Miranda Gardner. I am Director of Investigations at the Commissioner for Sustainability here in the ACT. I was wondering if each of the panel members or some of you could share an example of a really good planning outcome that you've been involved with or are aware of.
Does anyone want to start that off? Start from this end. Tomi, did you want to start that one off?
Okay, so this is from Japan, but I have, when I was a PhD student, I was I made an evaluation system how the combined, so integrated land use and transport would impact quality of life. So I set up quality of life indicators, and then how QOL score is enhanced by the integration of land use and transport into one big corridor from the city center to airport. So this case study was done in Takamatsu, where my parents were born, and so the idea is on this big corridor. It's not the corridor may not be a right word for this. It's more area, but from city center, that's I think 15 kilo, 20 kilo. It's very compact city. It's already compact city. But the population is 400,000, so similar to Canberra. And so on this corridor, my idea was to focus on, yes, the school, the airport and harbor, and the both fringe, both end, and then hospital, the government, and also schools in the sort of area, corridor area. And I presented to Takamatsu City, and then they actually implemented that plan. And they're still doing a lot of work to achieve that. And also, of course, we need to involve in Japan, public transport is provided by private companies, not from the government. So it's very difficult to organize this, because for private companies, if it's not really paying off what they invested, they don't want to do it. So the city council, involving city council, prefecture, government are imperative, and then we got lots of subsidies for the private railway and bus company. So we're actually doing that, and then actually the ridership increased, and and of course there are some park and ride system implemented, and also some development of apartments and also housing area developed alongside of the train lines. So this is actually, I would like to see a bit longer until I can actually say it's success, but it's going at the moment. Yeah.
And I would say, I moved from Sydney to Melbourne in 1992. And, I love Sydney, but it was a bit dodgy, and there was lots of good music, but it was what was really interesting to see is just how things that were peripherally planning questions like changing the alcohol licensing, changed the whole centre of Sydney. And when, Rob Adams and Malcolm Snow, who was here, we engaged with really strongly back then, the city was literally empty when I arrived. We used to kick the footy up Swanston Street. And so it's just amazing how some things are not about the strategic decision at the large scale, but the tactical, small understandings of what the little changes that might affect people's economic decisions around investment might make. And I know that, Rob Adams at that stage had, brokers working for him. And that's how probably everyone does it now, but back then he was like talking to individual business owners and saying, how would this help if we did this? And that sort of idea of kind of being a broker, that's not always about the strategic, but actually being able to see the little thing that might be changed. I think those they're still planning decisions, but they might not be ones that require the master plan.
Any other panel members?
Yeah, look, I think a really interesting opportunity we're involved at the moment is probably how layers of planning can really inhibit the opportunity to design with country. And so we're working on a project with ourselves, and many probably know Odenata, who do a lot of work around threatened species, urban design, and we were trying to, so the family that owns the land, it's very interesting, they're an Italian family who've been a small to medium enterprise for many years, and the discussion about legacy and everything is where an alignment happened with the community, and they're very interested in about how do you unlock some of these places for new approaches, which then when they have, so many adjacent planning ideas that mean that you get the types of things. This is in southwest Sydney where I live, and you've probably seen some of the most abhorrent ideas for residential design in Australia in those spaces, with no infrastructure and all these things, but then also people being very disconnected from the place that they live in. So this family is very interested in around that idea of custodianship and that being part of a governance of place, the topography of it, how do we restore it, as being a way to actually get the political will to say, we're going to, all these weird things that we've got overlaid on this place that make it probably having to be broken up into all its little functions that will never come together, how do we actually create a new type of place by taking those things away and allowing an exception? And the exception is essentially myself and Nigel from Odenata are charged with going in and trying to, talk the appropriate ministers around from this model. But what we see is people the opportunity to live in a way that people want to choose to live, and part of it is about the way, the structure of the place that they live in and the typologies that they live in, but that it is centred around this idea of participating in a restorative, regenerative place. So sometimes lots of great ideas, eventually sometimes we almost need to sort of like go away and go, what's an innovative thing? Because we've put lots and lots of years and generations of thought, and things change over time, and sometimes that means we end up with this tapestry, which is really hard to work with when we're talking about the context of country.
Thank you.
Hi, this question is for Hitomi. My name's Clay. I work in delivering infrastructure for transport. My question is that I'm a huge proponent of multimodal travel. It's great. I caught a bus and rode my bike here. That's an easy decision for me to make. But in a future scenario when we're expected in 2090 to have 5 times the amount of days over 35 degrees, that might not be such a easy decision to make, and it might be more challenging to get people into that. Do you have any solutions to that, or any ways that we need to approach planning differently?
Yes, that's a good question. And I cannot change the weather in Canberra, and nobody can. And also the problem with, one thing I'm very frustrated with the census date is it's usually in August, where it's very cold in Canberra. So the use of bicycle drops during winter time in Canberra. So it's a little bit unfair for us that census doesn't capture how much we ride bicycles. And yes, I think I'm not doing now the last 12 months, but I was cycling to university every morning, and it's very hot, and I get very sweaty and I look unprofessional, and I think everyone has the same problem. And we sort of advocate to university that we need more shower rooms, but it also takes time. So yeah, I don't think I have a great answer to you, but I think that we can probably, if you can do, you can probably do a bit more shift work. You go, or when it's 35, 36 degrees, you just work from home, or if you can, or we go early in the morning and avoid the very hot time, or use public transport, then, so that as much as possible. That's probably what I can say, but I'm sorry,
lived in
I
Dubai.
have a same problem too, yeah.
I lived in Dubai, and
Yeah.
I used to ride my bike in 40-degree heat, and a lot of the Filipino and other workers did, and I think maybe Australians just need to harden up and accept that they're living in a hot country, and it's going to get hotter, but it's been a hot place, and maybe get used to it a little bit, start drinking more water.
That's, yeah, there's also same thing happening in a different part of the world. In Netherlands or Copenhagen, where cycling is really predominant, so they cycle in winter with high heels and suits and leather boots, so they don't care. So that's also the thing, yeah.
Hey, this is Nayan, and I am a Master of Planning student from Macquarie University. So I just had, I know we spoke about a lot of wicked problems, and Matt, you briefly touched upon the missing middle in the housing, and I know NSW has a lot of strategies and the SEP driving the diverse housings and dwellings, and also the TOD SEP. So similarly, in Canberra, like we saw in the transport presentation, like we definitely need to increase the urban densities, but at the same time, like we have a lot of land in relation to our population. So my question is, what is the right type of housing typology for Canberra? And then if the government is not promoting the missing middle, why is that so? And what's a good solution or a good mix, you would say? Thanks.
One panel member, if I could volunteer for that.
People are looking at me, but the last thing you need is the planner from Queensland to come and tell you how to do it. I mean, I think one of the things that's really exciting about Canberra is you have inherited such an interesting urban structure that facilitates different typologies, and I think, you know, particularly the centre's structure is a really interesting and significant opportunity, and I know it's not lost on the profession, the built environment practitioners, and the wider community. I think there is no one typology of housing that you need, and I think that's true of all jurisdictions. What you do need is obviously a diverse mix in the right locations. And I think that's where good planning can help when we get it right. But it's not sufficient as well, because I think in urban change environments, you also need other tools to realise the plan. And in places like Canberra, land assembly, I think, is a really interesting question, and tenure's come up today, which, you know, perhaps makes it a bit easier here, perhaps not, because I think long-term leasehold is still viewed as private land anyway by the owners, by the lessees, but ultimately planning can take us as far as it can, and it can take us pretty far, but I also think it's really important for us to think about the tools that are going to get us the housing diversity we need, because we know we need more diverse housing. The demographic drivers tell us that, the housing choice drivers tell us that, the affordability drivers tell us that. The model of building large housing on small lots as the model of new housing cannot continue in this country, and we, though, as built environment professionals, need to think about how we show the exemplars of how it can be different and better and meet people's needs in an affordable and resilient and sustainable way.
Thank you very much to everyone in this room, but especially to our speakers. Thank you so much for everything that you've done today. So thank you. We can do a... I'd also really like to thank Nicole and Greta in the audience, wherever you are, who've made today possible through the Henry Halloran Research Trust and the University of Sydney. PIA couldn't have done this. The PIA ACT team is teeny tiny. And so we are really grateful and thankful for having the support of really what the Festival of Urbanism has created throughout the country. And we're very proud that we got to do an entire day. So thank you so much again to yourselves. And I certainly would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Pia. I'm a volunteer and I just do this on top of everything else that I do. But thank you so much to the Institute, but also Tessa, who isn't here, but she is the Executive Officer for New South Wales ACT. And she is the amazing woman who goes behind the scenes and sorts everything out. And so we just turn up and go, hello. And it's wonderful that we can do that. So I want to say thank you to her. And really, Max and Tom, thank you so much for running today, for organising today. You've been an example of what we have as planners in the ACT. So I really want to thank you for everything you've done, and you definitely deserve a round of applause. And also just to Wally and Karen for welcoming us to this country. I've been in Australia only for 10 years. As of in 7 days, it would have been 10 years that I've been in Australia. And to be welcomed so warmly onto country, I think, is something that is incredibly privileged for us to have experienced that. So I would like to thank them. And my final thank you is to all of you for actually attending, for being here, for listening, and for hopefully taking this on into your daily lives of the questions and thoughts and sparks that have come out from the speakers today. Because fundamentally, what you do is where the change happens. You know, we can talk about it, we can do our small changes, but it's all of us collectively making those changes that's actually going to make Canberra an amazing place to live into the future. So thank you very much, and I hope that you take everything you've learned today into your daily lives so we make Canberra a better place fundamentally. So thank you very much.